Good morning. This is Mrs. Perrotte. I am here today to interview my husband, Donald Naosano Perrotte, on a topic that he was discussing with me this morning, and it was quite a fascinating subject, and I think it's very important for every student of the Potawatomi language to hear, because he would like to share about the way the language is taught at this time versus the way that he learned it, and how our current teaching methods in the year 2021, how this is going to shape the future of the Potawatomi language, and whether or not this is a good trend or a fearsome trend. And at this time, I would like to give my husband the opportunity to introduce himself in his own language.
Bonjour, Quinoa. Ninsen Naosano. Iej na Kazian. Podewad Mindau. Memak? Shkoden ni. Eyaoyan. Shkoden niak de Bendagwas. Iba Weshkrat dem gut. Kansas. Shnakadek I. Kiwan.
So this morning I'd like to ask you about learning the language as a young child, because you are a heritage fluent speaker, which means you didn't learn this language from a book, you learned it from your elders. So in learning from your elders, did they ever give you teachings about the language itself? I know they gave you teachings about many, many topics, but what about the language that they delivered those teachings in?
As I recall, learning the language, let me say this first of all. Any child, even if learning English, learns through a process of listening and repeating, listening and repeating, listening and repeating. If the person they are listening to has good English usage, grammar, and all that, these little people are going to probably have pretty good vocabulary and will be making very few mistakes upon entering first grade, second grade, third grade, and so on. Witness the fact that we have a granddaughter, Anna, who has quite a vocabulary at 9 years of age. She sounds much like a high school student rather than a third grade student. And it's mainly because you and I speak so eloquently and intellectually in front of her. We don't try to put on airs and talk down to her. We simply talk to her like another adult, and she picks it up. Mm-hmm. The same thing could be said about how I learned my language. None of the elders, none of the adults that I hung around with at that time, that I listened to, tried to talk to me like a baby. Baby talk, in other words. They spoke to me as an equal. And that's the peculiar, unique, wonderful thing about how I grew up as a Anishinaabe. I was treated as an equal. Thus, I learned the language not as a child, not as a baby, but as another adult, so to speak. True, I had many things that I said possibly as a child would say, but I grew into full maturation with that language in due time. Learning the language for me was a system of listening and speaking, listening and speaking, listening and speaking, constant listening and speaking. I do not recall any adult, elder adult especially, ever giving me any kind of lecture or any kind of teaching on our language, its origins, or the way we say things. Once in a while they would say things like, well, that's the way the Winnebagos say that, or that's the way the Southern Potawatomi say that, the Prairie Potawatomi, and the Forest County Potawatomi say it just a little bit differently. And they would only make references like that. Yeah, oh, Xenian ni. Mina oh, Shkodani. Yeah, that they would say stuff like that. But it was never anything to do with grammar. It was just a difference in dialect. They mentioned dialect and some of the differences we had, but that's about all I recall. There were never any heavy lectures, any heavy revies, as you want to call them that, regarding our language. But I hope that answers your question. And
just to be clear for anyone who might be listening to this, when was the first time you heard the English language? About how old were you?
Probably about 5 years old. Just a minute, let me answer your question. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in a pretty sheltered community because I was not allowed to go downtown, to go among the whites, as it were, until I was old enough. And those elders that governed the community, like my grandfather, for example, was one of the people who made major decisions regarding the community. And also because I was his grandson, he determined whether or not I was ready for something. And I remember one day he asked me to go with him. And Grandma came out and asked us where we were going. And he said, we're going downtown to pick up some supplies, some things. And with that, off we went. I had seen white people who delivered certain things to the community we lived in. There were farmers in the area that would deliver certain things to the people. There was one farmer who always shared his beef with us. And sometimes they would stop by and bring chickens that were already butchered and leave them. There was one farmer in particular who believed like we did in terms of he accepted us. He may not have believed in absolute terms the way we did, but he knew that we had something that he didn't have. And sometimes he would ask some of the men who worked for him to pray for this or that. And I remember one time he asked my Uncle Fred, could you please ask your dad to pray for rain? Fred came home, asked his dad to pray for rain. That was my grandpa. Fred was my uncle. Grandpa and some of the elders went out, started a little fire, put tobacco down, prayed for rain. By late afternoon, by around probably 6-ish, 5:30, 6-ish, it clouded up and started raining. That farmer never forgot that. And so he would often ask if the people living on the bluff could pray for certain things. And as a result of that, he began to send up meat and send up chickens and other things that he and his family set aside for us. So I saw that man. I remember, oh yeah, come on. So that's a white man. And so I was very puzzled and very curious about white people from that point on. I saw how they dressed. I saw the nice things they had. But I also saw the working side of them. Later on, I went to work myself on farms in the area and worked on a lot of dairy farms and learned that industry through a farmer that I worked for, Ernst Kegler, his name was. He was a German farmer. But my first introduction to them was when I went with my grandpa downtown. He literally introduced me to people. This is my grandson. And he would do it with the storekeeper who spoke a lot of Potawatomi. He introduced me as his grandson in Potawatomi to that man. And that man, that's who that is. You know, he would tease me in Potawatomi. And he ended up giving me candy, a big stick of peppermint candy. Big long thing, about almost 2 feet long that thing was. I remember that man was very kind and generous to the native people. He let them charge things, and when they got their annuity checks from Kansas, they would pay their bill. So those were some of my memories with the white people from the small community where I grew up. They were kind and generous to the native people. We didn't experience racism, bigotry, or any kind of hatred. It may have existed, but we didn't experience it.
Was English the dominant language in that town, or were there other languages spoken in general? You mentioned a German farmer.
English was the main language, but I knew that German was also spoken, and also Polish was also spoken. Going more toward Vesper, Wisconsin, toward Wisconsin Rapids in the southerly direction, there were Polish farmers. Up in the area that we lived in, most of them were German. So those two languages were spoken. Yeah, plus English.
So going back to the community in which you grew up in, not being exposed to many other non-Native American languages until you were 5, would it be a safe assumption to say that you learned all of your stories and instructions and basic modes of living in your language, your original language?
Yes, definitely. There was not anything that I did not learn in my language. I didn't learn my ceremonies in English. I didn't learn the songs out of a book. Grandpa didn't say, well, we're going to have a ceremony tomorrow and I want you to learn pages from page 21 through 86 and get ready for that. I didn't even know how to read. We didn't have books. There were some of us that could read, like my Uncle Bill and my Uncle Fred. They could read a little bit because they had already gone to school in the white schools down there. But, and there may have been some books, but I certainly couldn't read them. I learned Potawatomi, as I said, listening, speaking, listening, speaking, listening, speaking. I had a very adept way of listening. My listening was accentuated. I remember one time Grandpa said this to me, and I will translate it for you in English, since I want these folks to understand what I'm saying. They wouldn't understand me if I spoke in my language. There's no point in chewing my cabbage twice, first in Potawatomi and then in English. But I remember one time he said, listen. Listen to me. Listen to your elders. Listen to the wind. Listen to the trees. Listen to the insects. Listen to the birds. Listen to everything. Oh, no, Samas, he said. My grandson, my grandchild. Listen, learn to listen to everything, because everything has a language. Even the earth has a language. And that really puzzled me. I didn't ask questions, but I remember later on I approached him and I asked him, if I went over by a big tree that I liked. I liked to sit under this one big tree. I said, if I went over there and sat under that tree and talked to that tree, would that tree understand me? And he just looked at me and he said, what did I tell you? Learn to listen. Of course that tree would understand you, but you have to learn to listen. And you have to also pay the price, he told me. Later on, I was to find out that paying the price meant to go and fast and go without different things in this life that we're so dependent upon, to prove to the spiritual world that you indeed wanted to communicate and that you were willing to shed your humanness in order to communicate with them, hear them, and listen to them. It didn't take me long to figure that out. Everything I learned was in the language. My language, my customs, everything. Protocols that I needed to know. I learned by watching how people conducted themselves with each other. I learned the ones that should be treated with deference. I learned the elders that I should respect. My grandma once told me something about respect. She said, "Dan mo in wi ya." She said, if you're respecting someone, and she knew that I was the one who cleaned out spittoons and cleaned out the lodge area, sweeping it, picking up anything that might have fallen, cigarette butts, because some of the men rolled their cigarettes and smoked. Others bought store-bought cigarettes. But it was my job, along with my Uncle Leroy, to clean the lodge area, taking the spittoons after they had a session in there, whether it be practicing singing or doing other things that they did. Sometimes they would just gather to visit and talk and plan. But we would empty the spittoons out and take them down and clean them with a brush, with an old brush. They were big cans. Vegetables and stuff like that used to come in big cans in those days, not these little small cans you see in grocery stores now. And she knew that I did that. And she was telling me about respect one day. To show proper respect for someone, she said. If you ever walk in there and you see that someone has not placed the spittoons where they should be placed, and some elder is looking for a place to spit and he can't find a spittoon can, you go over there and cup your hands and place your hands like that and invite him to spit in your hands. And then take it out and wash it off. Clean your hands. I had to do that with an old-timer one time who could barely see. But he could see enough to know who I was. It's not that he was totally blind. But that old man doted on me after that. Oh, no samas, no samas. Ni Pedro, oh, no samas, he'd say. Where's my little grandson? My little grandson, where is he? He'd literally ask for me. I made such an impression on him that day, and I think Grandma sensed that I was the type of kid that would do exactly what she said. And I found that many of the elders counted on that I would do exactly what they said. I could be trusted. I was a very good kid, shall we say.
It sounds like you have had a lot of interactions with a lot of different elders, a lot of both male and female, your grandparents, grandfather and grandmother, and other elders in the community. Did you ever notice any differences in the way different people used the language? In particular, did men speak differently than women, or did older people speak differently than younger people?
Oh, yes, I noticed stuff like that. As you said, there were a lot of people that came and went. The bluff, as it were, Pquawkik, that was a very important place because it consisted of people who refused to move to Kansas. It consisted of runaways, people who refused to buckle into the United States and its somewhat awesome power back in those days. Running away from them, they became known as the rovers, the roving Indians. And in time, different farmers and different white people reached out to them, feeling sorry for them perhaps. And that's how we came to settle in other places. Skunk Hill was another name that we called Pquawkik, the bluff. That wasn't the only place. There was another place in Roselleville. There were other places further north, McCord, Phillips, Prentice, and places like that in northern Wisconsin, where there were lumber camps where they settled and worked for a time. But we who settled on the bluff, our elders and some of our younger men, middle-aged men, went to work in those other places, but they always came home. And that was like a central, almost like a capital of sorts, of traditionalism. And ceremonies were conducted there. If you go up there today, you'll see two huge rings that are there. One huge ring and a smaller ring, a dance ring, where at one time it was ringed by mats and had makeshift walls placed around it. That was the lodge, so to speak. And that's where they met. There was an entranceway, you can see that. And now there are trees that ring that whole area. Giant cedars that grew around the area because it's been such a long time. And the lower ring where the women sat and some of the other teachings took place, the preparatory teachings and other things where they prepared themselves, that is there to this day yet. And there are rings in Amberg, Wisconsin. There are rings down closer to Peshtigo, Wisconsin. There are rings here and there of these raised mounds of earth about maybe 1.5 to 2 feet in a circle. Many white people have inquired about these. There are rings in northern Wisconsin and wondering what they were. Some white people, older white people, knew what they were because their grandparents or great-grandparents had witnessed some of these things in some of these ceremonies. In some of the areas, Native people were held in high esteem by some of the whites because, as I said, they knew that when we prayed, things happened, and many of them came to trust that. And many times they hid the Native people from the authorities and eventually gave them places to stay and permitted them to buy land from them, knowing that they had annuities coming to them. Even though they refused to settle in the reservation areas, the monies that were owed to them were still paid to them. So these kinds of things happened, and there were many different tribes, Menominees, Winnebagos, Ojibways, that came to the bluff for teachings from some of the elders that were there because some of the elders were renowned. My great-great-grandpa, John Young, was a very renowned elder who traveled all over teaching. And his nephew, John Louis, was a very renowned elder, as were some Ojibwe elders, the people who came down from Lac de Flambeau. Those people. So I certainly saw a mix of elders, and that's one of the reasons why I grew up with knowing different languages, was introduced to Menominee Ojibwe, and at that time the old Odawa language, which is not even spoken anymore. It's been completely absorbed by the Ojibwe language.
You said that this was almost a capital of traditionalism, and as people went out to work, they would come back. When did you start to notice the people were not coming back?
Probably when I was about 6 or 7 years old, after I started school. Went to school down there in Cranmore, Wisconsin, at the Cranmore Graded School, and that wasn't that far. That we were driven there by one or another relative or uncle, and there were times I noticed that people chose to just move and found jobs for themselves elsewhere, found homes that they were much more comfortable with, that had indoor plumbing, indoor lavatories, shall we say, toilets, running water, and electricity, and things like that. We didn't have that on the bluff. All we used there was kerosene lamps or gas lanterns, white gas. And even though that was an efficient way of doing things, we didn't have electricity there. We never got electricity there. It was always living like pioneers, so to speak. Outhouses, though we kept them very neat. We were a very industrious, very neat community. When anybody came around, we kept it clean and policed the area. White people noticed that about us. They were not afraid to hire us because we were so industrious in that way.
Coming from a culture that is very focused on oratory and listening and speaking, can you recall the first time that you saw Potawatomi in written form?
I think probably when I was about 12 years old, I did see a book that had been printed. I think the author was Forrest Potawatomi. I can't remember his name now. But he was a traveler, and he had traveled to Washington, D.C. representing his people. And he traveled to different reservation areas, talking to different leaders, swapping ideas, I would imagine. But there was a book that he left that was printed, and it was in the old Ba-Ba-Bi-Bo system. And that's where I first learned that they could produce sounds and imitate. They called it the vowel system. I knew enough English to know what that was all about. And there was a consonant chart in there, a very rudimentary consonant chart and a rudimentary vowel pronunciation chart as to how you should pronounce the words. I do recall those kinds of things. And I guess I wondered to myself, even as young as I was, 12 years of age, what is going to become of this language that we're using? Even at that age, I started to wonder about things. That was so many years ago. 70 years, for me, to be exact. That's a long time to have lived and learned by listening and repeating what my elders said. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
I do have some things I would like to remark on, some thoughts that I have that I wrote about. And I will piggyback on the statement I just made. I did wonder at that time when I first saw printing, when I first saw the printing of our language, and the rudimentary attempts at trying to write our language and form some sort of way to pronounce the words and which consonants to use, which we didn't use, things like that. I became aware of that when I was quite young, about 12 years of age. Though I did not pick up that book and really start to kind of study it until I was about 16. There were a lot of experiences I had in between that time. But today I'm teaching a language. I have learned English very well. I was taught by 2 English teachers to speak this English language. So therefore, I know English probably better than many of my elders did at one time. I knew English. I interpreted for many of them. If we went somewhere, and they once they found out that I could speak Potawatomi so well and I could speak English so well, they would just tell me what they wanted, and I would tell whoever what they wanted. I remember I went down to Kansas one time with my Uncle Bill, and we went to a restaurant in Mayetta, Kansas. And we were sitting there and looking at the menu, and I was reading the menu to them, and describing what was on the menu to these old people that I was along with, and my Uncle Bill was there too. And I told this guy, one old lady, is there pork on that menu? You know, she was asking, but the way I would translate that is there pig on the menu, you know. And I said, yes. And I described she was asking about pork chops. And I knew that. But the white waitress who came to take our order, I told her what this man wanted. I told her what the other man wanted in English, and I checked with them. And they'd nod their head at me, and then what the other man, and the old lady, and the lady, she said, "Oh, gosh." I said, I didn't say pork chops. I just said, because I was so accustomed to talking in Indian and then white and Indian English, you know. And I told them, "Oh, gosh, she wants pig," you know. He looked at me. "Oh," I said, "she wants pork chops." I quickly corrected myself. But you see, we had those kinds of things that happened. But I wanted to say this. At no time did I ever hear any elder tell me, say something to me in my language and say, "Now, young man, that is a noun," or "that is a verb," and "that is a transitive inanimate verb." At no time have I ever heard anything like that. Today, we're more concerned about what we're talking about. Animacy, inanimacy. And I wonder to myself sometimes if we shouldn't be teaching this language the way I learned it, just by listening and speaking. Listening and speaking. We live in a time, in a nuclear society, if you will. I'm just quoting what I read, where nobody has time anymore. Other things are predominant among us. They take predominance. I have to go to work. I don't have the time. I've got to sleep. I've got to rest. I've got to do this. We have so many things to do. Nobody has time to really learn the language the way we learned it. When I was a kid, we had all the time in the world for language, for listening to our beautiful language. I spoke to you one afternoon about the different shades of color in a tree and the different shades and colors in the grass and in the sky. They're not all blue. You have to describe the different shades and depths of blue that you see. Same thing with the grass. You describe the different shades of green, greenish, yellowish, brownish, and the different shades of bark. It's not all gray. And some of it is dark, some of it is light. And you describe all those things. Spots, flecks, streaks, These are things that we did very adeptly. You see, I can speak the English language quite well, but I can speak my own language equally as well. But it concerns me that today, in this day, we have people who are trying to learn this language, and they're reading it and writing it. And if I tell them that it has become a dead language, people don't understand what I mean by that. If it is written and recorded in a book, and you have to read it in order to learn it, it is a dead language. A living language is something that is spoken, and you learn it by listening to the speaker. And you're not so concerned about whether or not you're using the right verb or the right noun, or because these things are built into the language. We never concerned ourselves that way. In fact, all of the early ethnologists and archaeologists and anthropologists, all the ologists who ever traveled among us to collect information and data on our people, our languages, our lifestyles, our culture, they found out by comparing English with our language that we said things correctly. Nobody let me see. Did I use the right verb there? Nobody ever said that. I'm wondering if I used the right demonstrative when I was talking about that noun. I never heard anybody say stuff like that. And nowadays I think to myself, my God, what is going to happen to our language? I thought that when I was 12 years old, when I set eyes on the first book that I ever saw that had been written in Potawatomi by someone who had enough money to pay somebody to have it done. I remember thinking to myself, no, this is one. What is going to happen with our language? What is going to happen to our language? Now, as I sit on the fourth hill of my life, 82 years old soon, I wonder to myself, after I die, I am told that there are only 4 of us heritage fluent speakers left on this earth. 2 of them are older than me. 1 is younger than me. I'm kind of in between. When we die, there will be no more heritage fluent speakers left. Where will people go to hear the correct pronunciation of all this stuff that they read? Though it has a vowel consonant chart and everything else built into it, the books I mean, how will they know that they're pronouncing the word correctly? As it is, I hear clumsy attempts at someone trying to say Bodewadmi, Buddewadmi, Batawadmi, Buddewadmi. They'll say all kinds of things. They have a strange accent to everything they say. How will they know? Who will they go to learn the correct way to pronounce certain words? How will they learn how to blend particles to arrive at different words, to describe different things? That thought intrigues me and sometimes scares me to the depths of my soul. I believe that our language will change. The new speakers, the new learners will change our language. And we will have generations of speakers coming along who no longer speak the old Potawatomi that the 4 of us that are still alive today still speak. My cousin Jim Thunder and I once talked about this, and I remember talking to others about this. Here more recently, we've lost about 4 or 5 speakers within the last 10 years, 10 or 15 years. Their voices forever silenced. no longer to be heard. The true sounds of Potawatomi. Potawatomi. Ikagi Gitawat Godak. Napoksnagi Pamsewat. Wegwan Duxnagi Agijitskewat. Wegwan Duxnagi Benak Nagewat. Wegwan Duxna Asiawat. Joy Gadna. Ebzindagewat. With a Bemadzjuk. With a Sishmoon Eopi. That language will be a dead language. It's dead already. But it will be twice dead when you lose all your speakers. A living language is one that is used every day, in everyday context. And it's spoken by people. And they don't teach it out of a book. They teach it to you. This is how we say this. And you don't tell somebody this is how you say it. If you hear Grandma talking about, oh, Mishan is it tagen, you pass her the salt. Bien in motion is it tagen, bien in motion is question. Nien mon e. Hand me that. You know, you do things according to the way people speak. I never had anybody tell me, now this is the way you say this and this is what it means. You have a verb here, a noun here, you have a particle here, you have a suffix ending here, you have a prefix here. They're both called affixes. I never heard anybody tell me that. Nowadays, we have to tell our younger generation what everything means. Because we've been eaten up by the linguistic lifestyle. The lingualism, the linguophile that we become. We're forced to fit into the white man's mold of our language and what we're supposed to do. In a way, it's racist. It's biased. The dominant language is English, and everything has to fit English. The paradigm is English, and therefore what you say, what comes out of your mouth, and what you think about has to fit the English paradigm. In short, we've become colonized. Those people who think that way, they've become colonized. So the first thing you have to do is decolonize them. You have to end up, and then you become their enemy because everything that you say, they feel threatened by. They think they have to give all that up. That things that they've become so accustomed to. So I do wonder, what is the future of our language? What is the future of our ways? What are the future of our thoughts? What will happen to our people once people like me are dead and gone? People like my cousin Violet are dead and gone. People like my cousin Jim and Mary Jane are gone. Once we're gone, we happen to be related, the 4 speakers that are left. We happen to be related, and once we're gone, what happens to this language, this beautiful language that I speak today? I hear some people trying to speak it, and I hear so many mistakes, and I hear so many accents. And at no time have I heard some young person say, I am going to, instead of going to college and getting a degree in linguistics, a master's degree or a PhD, I'm going to call Mr. Perot or Mr. Thunder. I'm going to call Mr. Perot and ask him, can I come and be an apprentice? And if he happens to have room in his house, I will help his wife cook and clean and whatever else is necessary. If it's a woman. If it's a man, I will do all kinds of work around his house to take care of him as long as he teaches me the Potawatomi that I love so much, that I've grown accustomed to, and that I've developed a passion to learn. I've developed a passion for it. Therefore, I will trade my services to learn this beautiful language the way it should be learned from a fluent speaker. constantly hearing it, listening and speaking, listening and speaking, listening and speaking. At no time has anybody ever said that to me yet, and I don't know if they ever will. I've heard people allude to it. I heard one young man say, when certain things are right, I'm going to pack up and I'm going to come up and stay with you for a while. Well, you can't stay for a while. You got to stay forever. I stayed forever with my elders. I didn't leave them. I had to leave to go to school, yes, but I always came home. And my dying wish is to be buried, my ashes to be scattered where I was born, because now that place has been taken over by the Wood County Park System, and they will not permit me to have my body buried there. So I have to go around them and utilize the laws of this land. And the laws of this land say that I can have a cremation to my body. And it will be placed in an urn, and my wife will go up along with some of my relatives at some point later on and scatter my ashes in my beloved land, so that my final resting place will still be with those that I loved, that I grew up with, that I learned my language from, that I learned all my customs and ceremonies from. So you see, unless you have that kind of passion, you're not going to really want to learn this language. Everything you say is just doesn't mean much. If you really want to learn your language, study with a fluent speaker. Forget the books. Forget the consonant charts. Forget the vowel charts. Forget the equations. Forget the formats. Forget all the grammar. And just listen. Listen and speak. Listen and speak. Listen and speak. Those are my final words and what I think today. Io.